In my experience, 95% of the believers who face the test of persecution pass it, while 95% who face the test of prosperity fail it. It is more difficult to have enough or too much than to have too little.
Is the test of prosperity really as difficult as Ronald Blue suggests? A recent report from George Barna and Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center would be in agreement, since only 44% of evangelical believers view obedience to God as a best indicator of a successful life. And if you didn't catch the first part of this message with Mr. Blue, it was episode 65, where he speaks about the fact that our beliefs or our worldview are the driver of our behaviors, as Barna's research so clearly indicates as well. Well, just yesterday, I was actually reading a draft copy of a book that will be released soon entitled The Wealth Within from FCCI member Lawam Hailu. Lawam makes that similar case for worldview and identity awareness, and I quote, "Believers with a wealth mindset are anchored in their identity as royalty in Christ. They think, decide, and behave like nobility in the kingdom, embodying a spirit of excellence. Their lives are marked by generosity and servanthood. And above all, they are kingdom-minded," end quote. Well, in this second portion of Ron's message, he will provide some particular strategies, some really practical strategies in determining how much is enough in the areas of lifestyle, personal accumulation, inheritance, and don't miss his statement about inheritance where he says, if you don't leave wisdom, don't leave wealth. And the fourth area of giving and charity. Well, here's Ron with practical wisdom on how much is enough.
And I think that the greatest risk facing America today is the threat of prosperity. Let me read something to you out of Money, Possessions, and Eternity, written by Randy Alcorn. And he says this. He's quoting a letter. He said, "The following are extracts from an insightful letter John Steinbeck wrote to Adlai Stevenson, recorded in the Washington Post, January 28, 1960. So John Steinbeck wrote to Adlai Stevenson. It was recorded in the Washington Post, January 28, 1960, and here's what he said. "A strange species we are. We can stand anything God and nature can throw at us, save only plenty. If I wanted to destroy a nation, I would give it too much, and I would have it on its knees, miserable, greedy, and sick." See, I think that's the biggest threat we have, is prosperity. It's not techniques. It's not wisdom even. Well, maybe it is wisdom because we continue to pursue those things. But John Steinbeck, to my knowledge, was not a believer. But what he was communicating here was truth. A leader of the persecuted church in Romania who has spent considerable time in the West as well once told a group of us, "In my experience, 95% of the believers who face the test of persecution pass it, while 95% who face the test of prosperity fail it. It is more difficult to have enough or too much than to have too little." And it comes back to the wealth paradox. The more we have, the more choices we have. Revelation chapter 3, church at Laodicea says this. You remember the passage. "Write to Laodicea, to the angel of the church, to the angel of the church. God, yes, the faithful and accurate witness, the first of God's creation, says this: I know you inside and out and find little to my liking. You're not cold, you're not hot. Far better to be either cold or hot. You're stale, you're stagnant. You make me want to vomit." That's pretty graphic. "You brag, I'm rich, I've got it made. I need nothing from anyone, oblivious that in fact you're a pitiful, blind beggar, threadbare, and homeless. Here's what I want you to do. Buy your gold from me, gold that's been through the refiner's fire. Then you'll be rich. Buy your clothes from me, clothes designed in heaven. You've gone around half naked long enough. And buy medicine for your eyes from me so you can see, really see." That's called a paradigm shift. He said, buy your medicine from me, put it on your eyes so that you can see things as they really are. The people I love, I call to account, prod and correct and guide so that they'll live at their best. Up on your feet then, about face, run after God. That's an encouraging verse because it says that if we fall into the trap of prosperity, that because He loves us, He will reprove and discipline us. So as long as we're seeking what He wants, He's not going to let us continue in that trap. But we can avoid that trap if we can recognize it coming and deal with it appropriately. And then Revelation 3:20, what all of us understand, it says this, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." I think the insight for me in that passage, Revelation 3:20, was this. I always thought Revelation 3:20 was written to the non-believer. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And he says, "Then if anyone hears my voice," not my knocking, but my voice, "and opens the door," a volitional act on my part, "then I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." See, he's writing that to Christians. He's saying to Christians, "Christian, I want to have a relationship with you. I want to have a one-on-one relationship with you. I want to have the type of relationship that you experience one-on-one when you are sitting down with somebody over a meal." It's not the non-Christian he's talking to. He's talking to you and I, and he says, "I want that relationship." And he says, just before that, the problem is that you've allowed prosperity to get in the way because you have become self-sufficient. Or, as the Bible says, a fool, he doesn't lack mental acuteness, but he lacks, he's self-sufficient rather than God-sufficient. The fool is self-sufficient. And he says, when you begin to trust in the things that I've given to you, and when you begin to grasp your hands on those things, then we can't have a relationship. Now, come back to Matthew chapter 6. Here's the key. The key is that the only way to avoid that threat is to learn how to open it up. It's to learn how to give. And it's not giving because God needs the money, because He doesn't need the money. But He needs your heart. And He wants your heart. And He can't have your heart as long as there's anything else that is grasping it and that you're trying to reach for. So, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." I found myself not too long ago just kind of walking through the day, thinking, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If I open that door, He wants to have that relationship with me right now. What is it, Lord, that is acting as a barrier to that relationship?" I said, I wanted to challenge you to stewardship so that you wouldn't miss the relationship. And it's the relationship with the living Lord. The more we have, the more isolated we become as people. Which is, again, a good reason for conferences such as this. The second, maybe bigger barrier than too much is the threat of fear. Now, I'm going to read out of the Old Testament in Numbers, which is my favorite book of the Bible. "So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob at Laboth Hamath. When they had gone up into the Negev, they came to Hebron, where several people lived. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan of Egypt. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between the two men, with some of the pomegranates and the figs. That place was called the valley of Eshcol, because the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down came from there. When they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Very fruitful land. Thus they told him and said, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and here is its fruit." We could say that about America today. "Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large, and moreover, we saw the descendants of Enoch there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites and the mosquito bites are living in the hill country." It doesn't say that. This is the message. This is Ron's message. "And the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan." Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us." So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. And here's the key verse. There also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. That's a paradigm. And then they jumped to the conclusion and said, and so we were in their sight. Now they didn't know that. But 10 out of 12 gave a bad report. I believe in America today that 10 out of 12 Christians are scared to death. They're afraid of what the future holds. They're afraid of what the elections hold. They're afraid of what the stock market might do. They're afraid of a lot of things. 10 out of 12. 10 out of 12 of the Israelites went into the land, saw the fruit, and wouldn't go in. And it says in the next chapter, chapter 14, that fear consumed them. My concern is that as we become more prosperous, we begin to grasp what it is that God has blessed us with, and then we develop the paradigm of fear because we are so afraid that we might lose it. In 1992, Larry had just written The Coming Economic Earthquake. Sold over 1 million copies. I would suspect most of you here have at least heard of the book or have read the book. Also written in 1992 was a book called Bankruptcy 1995. Now, quite frankly, I was delighted that both those books were written because they both did more for my business than anything in the last 15 years. We literally were getting hundreds of telephone calls a month from people who were scared to death. What do we do? Should we liquidate our retirement funds and pay off our mortgage? Should we sell our business? What should we do? Should we liquidate all of our investments and put it into gold and bury it in the ground? Bill Clinton was reelected in the fall of 1992. Democrats swept into both houses of Congress. I remember sitting in a FRC board meeting 2-3 days after the election. I thought Jim Dobson was going into catatonic depression. He was so devastated, and rightly so, because he had worked so hard in this election and had prayed so hard, and it didn't work. And he looked at that and he said, we're doomed. 2 years later, I'm sitting in the FRC board meeting again. Newt Gingrich has been elected Speaker of the House. Republicans have swept in, quite surprisingly. And Jim is saying, we won. And I said, you know what? Doesn't make any difference. Because it's not an economic or a political problem. It's a moral problem. And there is not a political or economic solution. Now, Jim knows that. Gary Bauer knows that. They all know it, but these are passionate people who are leaders and feel very, very strongly. And they're right. And they are defending us, if you will, in the family and politically in Washington. But my concern is this, and that is that we not get gripped by fear. In 1992, on February 8th, 1992, I turned 50 years old. That was a devastating, devastating day. The stock market was at 3,300. It was an all-time high, right around 3,300. And everybody knew in February of 1992 that it could not go any higher than 3,300. We all knew that. Anybody in the investment business knew it couldn't go any higher than that. May close at 6,000 this week, so that tells you what kind of investment guru that I am. But I was asking myself some questions. What do I tell my staff? What do I tell my clients? What has changed? What's the future hold? And I remember at age 40, February 8th, 1982, when I turned 40, going through the same questions. What's the future hold? What's going to happen? Let me refresh your mind in February of 1982. We had an oil crisis. We had inflation at 14%. We had a prime rate at 21%. We had interest rates at over 20%. We had mortgage rates at 14, 15, 16, 17%. Most prognosticators believed that by 1985 we would have an inflationary blowout. Triple-digit inflation. You remember the time? Frankly, 1982 was a worse time than 1992 at the beginning of the year. Well, it didn't help me to think back to 1982 because I was afraid then too. I was afraid in 92, I was afraid in 82. Well, in 1972 I was 30. Was not a believer. I was living in Indiana. But I remember 1972. That's when we went off of the gold standard. That's when the prime rate hit 10% for the first time. That's when we had the oil embargo in 1972. I remember being very, very much afraid. Again, I wasn't a Christian, but you know what the best-selling book was in 1992? Probably many of you have read it. The Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey. It's one of the all-time bestsellers, if not the bestseller Christian book that's ever been written. Well, it wasn't helping me. So I went back to 1962 when I turned 20. I was in the fraternity house at Indiana University, more concerned, frankly, about having a good time than I was about anything else, but I was afraid. And I was afraid because I remember sitting in the basement of the fraternity house watching television and seeing Nikita Khrushchev bang his shoe on the table at the UN. Remember it? Saying, "We will bury you." I was afraid in 1962. I didn't think that there would be a world to graduate to in 1962. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had a recession, and of course we had Khrushchev at the UN. So it wasn't helping me any. I went back to 1952 when I was 10. Don't remember a lot about it, but I do remember this. It was during the Korean War. In my hometown of Lafayette, Indiana, they just had converted the county courthouse to a bomb shelter. In fact, bomb shelters were a big rage in the 1950s. I remember the 1950s as not being a real pleasant time. They're now pleasant to look back on, but they weren't pleasant at the time. I remember being trained to get under my seat in grade school because of the nuclear bombs that potentially could come. Remember that, those of you that are as old as what I am? Well, 1942 is when I was born. That was a good time. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, and I don't remember 1942 very well at all, but I would suspect that that was a time of great fear. 1932, 10 years before I was born, that was the Great Depression. Now, what am I trying to say? Let me give you some bottom lines. Number one, economic uncertainty is certain. There has never been a time when there has not been economic uncertainty. Never. Prosperity, secondly, prosperity is only true in retrospect. It's only as we look back that it seems to be prosperous. We look back into the 50s, great time. 60s, we survived the 60s. 70s, stock market didn't do anything in the 70s. 1980s, probably one of the most prosperous times that the world has ever seen. And the 1900s or the 1990s are even better. Prosperity is only true, however, in retrospect. I wrote a book called Storm Shelter several years ago now, 3 years ago, and it basically was to say, hey, there's hope. The publisher says it won't sell. I said, I don't care. I believe that we have great reason to hope. They said, books on fear will always outsell books on hope. We kind of revel in the fear thing. Third thing, cycles are normative. In other words, things will go up, but they'll also go down. Cycles are both biblical and they're normative. And fourth, the future cannot be predicted. So I don't care what anybody says about the future, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because we don't know what we don't know. If you think about that, we don't know what we don't know. In 1942, well, let me give you two illustrations. In 1942, there were 5 computers in the world. Thomas Watson said, at best, there's a market for maybe 20 computers worldwide, if we saturated the market. And he was the chairman of IBM. 1978, there were 200,000 computers worldwide. Now, that's what, 18 years ago? There were 200,000 computers. In 1995, there are 30 million computers, PCs, in the United States, and we are throwing away 1 million computers a month. These statistics are a little old, so maybe even more than that at this point. Who would have thought what computers brought to our society? As I listened to several testimonies, listened to some of these discussion groups, have talked to several of you, I am amazed at the creativity of what's going on. We don't know what we don't know. In 1972, there was an oil crisis, and everybody knew that we would run out of oil in 40 years. Matter of fact, there was a study done in Rome that said in 40 years, the world supplies of oils at current consumption would be used up. 1992, they redid the study. They found that the world supply of oil was 60 years. So not only did we not use half of it, we have more. And why? Because we didn't even know anything about personal computers and miniaturization. The Japanese auto market had not even really begun at that point. It was a joke in 1972, and now, of course, it's dominant in the world. Bottom line is this. We don't have an economic crisis, we have a moral crisis. We are living in an unprecedented time in the last 2,000 years. It's estimated that $14 trillion is going to change hands from one generation to the next in the next 40 years. 14 trillion. There was a secular man named Rosenberg who wrote a book called Wealthy and Wise. He estimates that there's $100 billion a year more that could be given, not if people tithe, but if they just gave 10% out of their growth and net worth. Not even dip into their principal, just gave out of the growth in their net worth. $100 billion a year more without hurting net worth. We're seeing the Jesus film. We're seeing Promise Keepers. We're seeing the statistics that I quoted from Adrian Rogers. We're seeing a lot of things happen. But here's the conclusion. Windows of opportunity don't stay open forever. Joseph may only have had one shot. Daniel may only have had one shot. After World War II, General Douglas MacArthur wrote the American church, and he said, send us 1,000 missionaries. We could only come up with 100 that we could send to Japan. Today, Japan is a secular nation. You contrast that with, how many of you saw Richard Nixon's funeral and Billy Graham at Richard Nixon's funeral? I just happened to turn on the television and see it. It was an amazing thing. Here was Billy Graham standing in front of 4 living presidents, speaking around the world. The funeral was carried all over by every major network, was carried all over the world. Now, he had a decision to make. What was he going to share? He gave the clearest presentation of the gospel that I have ever seen. And I thought to myself, you know what? The Billy Graham Evangelistic Society, organization couldn't have got him that speaking opportunity. He spent a lifetime in preparation, and when the opportunity came, he took advantage of it. I believe, financially, that we're in a time of our world when there is more opportunity than what we have ever experienced, and I don't want you to miss the relationship, and I don't want you to miss the opportunity. And I think that FCC is right on the front lines. I think that you may have more opportunity to impact this world than what we'll never know until we get to eternity. This is a critical group. I got a call from a man a week ago, and he's an FCC member. He's not at this conference, and he said, I don't know whether to sell my business or not. It's worth $100 million. And he said, I could sell it today. If I keep it, it'll be worth $200 million in 5 years. I know that to be a fact. He is a committed believer. He's giving all of his wealth away, all of his wealth going into a foundation and liquidated over 25 years. Not that that's right, but that's his choice. His question to me was this. If I sell my business today, I'll have $5 to $10 million a year to give away. And he said 100,000 people coming to Christ every day. Adrian Rogers says 178,000. If it's 100,000 people coming to Christ every day, he said, Ron, do you know that means that we need 500 new pastors every day all over the world? He said, because if these people are coming to Christ, who's going to shepherd them? Bible schools and seminaries are not great attractions for fundraising. We like to fund the glamorous things. And he said, I believe God's called me to help start these Bible schools and seminaries all over the world. I called a friend of mine who he wanted to talk to and who had retired at age 40, sold his business. And I said to him, I said, Tony, would you be willing to talk to this friend of mine? He wants to know whether he should retire. You sold your business at age 40 and have been in full-time, basically work, and he's financially independent for the last 20 years. I said, Tony, I think that there is an army of men out there who are like you. And he said, you can't even count the number of men who have started businesses, because we are now at the end, not necessarily end, but we are seeing the fruits of the last 40 to 50 years, and we're the beneficiaries. There are thousands and thousands of businesses that are worth fortunes. Now, the question is, do you kill the chicken or do you give the eggs? And that's the question for you. I don't know the answer to that question, because I most often would say, don't kill the chicken. But I think in the case of the guy that called me, maybe it's time to kill the chicken. But I don't think that's necessarily the right answer in everybody's case. The question is, are you going to work to live or are you going to work to give? I think God has given a lot of people the ability to make a lot of money. That's a gift. It's not your own doing by any means if He's given you that gift. But He's given you the gift in order to use it. And if you take a hold of it like that, you won't have the relationship and you'll miss the opportunity. And I think FCC is that opportunity. And my encouragement to you is to listen to what God has to say through the rest of this conference.
Well, isn't it amazing that all these years later, that same statement that Ron made earlier is true? We don't have an economic crisis, we have a moral crisis. Well, that's exactly what Barna's research has proven in recent years as well. And upon reflecting on the data, Barna states in a February 2024 report, and I quote, "The only true hope for America at this point is a period of spiritual renewal that restores a widespread understanding and basis of truth, individual purpose, and personal responsibility within a community context. Only a spiritual awakening can usher in the required tidal wave of spiritual wisdom and commitment, and that kind of renewal does not happen overnight or randomly. It must become an intentional and long-term commitment." End quote. And it's to that very end, that need for a long-term commitment to spiritual renewal, that is the foundation of FCCI. And it's why Ronald Blue spoke at our conference so many years ago and encouraged that audience to remain faithful in pursuing godly character in business and in financial stewardship. Well, if we can serve your goal to transform this world through Christ as Barna suggests, please reach out to us at fcci.org. And we do hope that you'll consider joining us at this year's conference in September in Lake Tahoe. Learn more at conference.fcci.org. Thanks for listening, and may you find encouragement and inspiration in your journey as you lead a company for Christ.